Chapter 5 The Sorcerer's Sphere. Whoa. Jesse rolled back in his chair and stared at the screen. What am I supposed to do now? Daisy pointed to the blinking cursor at the bottom of the screen. Try keying there, she said. Try keying what? He asked. Did you get a good look at this guy? He's scary. Just tell him yes, Daisy said patiently, and see what happens. Jesse took a deep breath and rolled back to the computer. He flexed his fingers and key in capital letters, Y-E-S. Once again, the photograph stirred to life and lips moved. Very good. What are its salient characteristics? What does salient mean? Jesse asked Daisy. But it was the man on the screen who answered. By salient, we mean most noticeable, prominent. Jesse stiffened. How did he do that? How can he actually hear what we're saying? I don't know if I like that, he added, turning from the screen and cupping his hands around his mouth. Of course he can't, said Daisy. He probably just expects that most people don't understand the word. Go ahead. She gave his shoulders a gentle squeeze. Go ahead and what? This guy is giving me the creeps. Then he caught himself and apologized to the screen. Excuse me, mister. It's just I'm not used to trying to, talking to web, head. The picture on the screen remained silent and still. Right in her characteristics, salient characteristics, Jess, said Daisy. Why not start with the little green horn? Jesse nodded and put his hands on the keys. Stop, roared the voice. Jesse's fingers froze. In a softer tone, the professor said, It is not necessary for you to type your responses. I can hear you. Yikes! Daisy grabbed Jesse's neck. He can hear. I can indeed, said the professor, provided you take the trouble to make yourself understood, by which I mean enunciate. What does that mean? Jesse asked. The professor replied, It means you must speak clearly and slowly and succulently, and don't stir your words. Simply click the mouse when you wish to speak. Jesse gaped at the screen. Go ahead, Daisy nudged him. It's like an interview. Jesse clicked the mouse, cleared his throat, and said loud and clear and slowly, exactly the way he spoke to their great aunt Elizabeth, who was deaf as a tree stump. She has this little green horn on her head. The professor's face burst into a smile. Very good, he said. But there is no need to shout. I assure you, I am not deaf. Jesse blushed. Do go on, said the professor. Jesse nodded and clicked the mouse again. At a more moderate volume, he said, She hatched out of a geode. She has a forked tongue. She likes to eat limestone. Smells like hot chili peppers. She comes from the time before. Don't forget to say she can talk, Daisy whispered. Oh, right, Jesse said. She talks. Just then the left side of the screen lit up. The picture of the dragon turned bright green on a field of dazzling red and began blinking as if they just hit a jackpot. The old man's eyebrows lifted and grinned. Bravo, he told them. You have found yourself a dragon. Even though the cousins already knew this, it was nice to get the proper credit. When the screen stopped flashing, Jesse clicked the mouse and asked, Could you tell us what to feed her? I mean, besides limestone? Ah, said Professor Anderson, stroking his beard. Most interesting. This is the first instance of an actual limestone ingestion I have come across. I suspect your dragon ate limestone because limestone contains calcium. Your dragon is a hatchling. Hatchlings need large doses of calcium to fuel their initial growth. Feed her foods high in calcium: cheese, eggshells, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, spinach, Brussels sprouts, and dark leaf lettuce. Great, said Daisy. She can have my cabbage and Brussels sprouts every day this week. The cursor blinked. What else should we ask? Jesse wondered. Now that he was in the presence of an actual expert, his mind went blank. Wait. Daisy squeezed her eyes shut to help her remember. Ask him about some stuff in his book. Hoarding, masking, flaming. That kind of stuff. Jesse turned to the screen and clicked the mouse again. What is hoarding? He asked. The professor's bushy beard barely concealed a smile. First, Kilimanjaro, then Everest, eh? What's that mean? Jesse asked. Daisy thought for a second. I think he means hold your horses. Professor Anderson said, let's take one thing at a time, shall we? For now, all that's important for you to know is that daily fresh air and exercise are necessary for the development of healthy bones. Keeping a dragon is a considerable responsibility. Do not take it lightly. Do not take it lightly. The cousins turned and searched each other's faces. Where had they heard those words before? Suddenly, the entire screen flashed red. The picture of the dragon and the old man vanished, filling the space now in large, throbbing purple letters were the words, Beware the Dragon Slayer. Then the computer made an odd grinding noise and went blank. A dull message box appeared. Computer cannot view the present page. Check with your server and try again. Hey, Jesse said, pounding the table. What's the big idea? Try and get back in, said Daisy. Jesse rapidly keyed in www.founddragon.org. Maddeningly, the same message appeared. Where did he go? Jesse wanted to know. We need him to tell us about the Dragon Slayer. I mean, how can we protect Emmy if we don't know more? We'll try later, Daisy said. I'm starved, aren't you? Let's go to the dell for our picnic. Emmy can have the shells of our hard-boiled eggs. Plan? Plan, said Jesse. He logged off, discouraged, then headed down to the kitchen for lunch. There was a dense patch of laurel bushes at the top of the rise and that separated the backyard from an old cow pasture and barn that they called the dell. Jesse and Daisy had to drop to their knees and crawl through a tunnel in the laurels. Just when their knees started to scream, they arrived at the other end and stood up. The dell lay before them like a big bowl lined with clover and wildflowers, a rocky brook running through like a crack. On one side there was a mountain. The Native Americans had once lived there and called it Old Mother, because at certain times of the day, the side of the craggy mountain looked like the face of an old woman with a waterfall running down it like tears. Behind the big red dairy barn in the deep woods lay a so-called because they were too dense and dark for the cousins to venture beyond a few steps. On top of the barn's patched roof was a weather vane of a horse going wherever which way the wind blew him. Emmy struggled out of Jesse's hood and perched on his shoulder. She looked here and there, her pale green throat throbbing like a frog's. She scrabbled her prickly way down Jesse's arm and jumped to the ground. She flung out her forepaws. "Mama!" she cried, looking up the mountain. "Mama?" "Mama!" she cried again, looking across the pasture. "Mama!" she cried, looking down at the big red barn. Then she turned her eyes first on Jessie, then on Daisy, and bleated, "Emmy want Mama!" Jessie and Daisy looked at each other helplessly. What could they say? They had no idea where Emmy's mother was. One thing was fairly certain. Emmy's mother had once been dead since the time before, whenever that was, but there was no way to tell Emmy that. Not when she was such a young baby. Emmy took off down the hill, making whooping sounds. The cousins ran after her, but the little dragon kept the lead, her head bobbing above the tops of the clover as she cried, "Mama, Mama, Mama!" She hopped across the cow pasture, darted through a narrow gap in the barn door. Jessie and Daisy shoved aside the heavy sliding door. Emmy was standing in the middle of the barn, her head raised, having a bawling fit that shook the rafters. "Want Mama! Now!" she repeated in an ear-piercing, heartbreaking wail. "Can't you do something?" Daisy said, covering her ears and yelling at Jessie over the noise. "Pick her up, comfort her." Jessie pulled the knee sock out of his sweatshirt pouch and put it over his hand. Then he went over and picked up the squalling dragon, hoping he could help. "Hush, Emmy, hush," he crooned to her, and snuggled her as much as a wailing baby dragon was possible. "Jessie's got you." Whether it was the sound of his voice or the sight of the knee sock that calmed her, Emmy stopped bawling. She snorted, blowing dragon snot everywhere, and curled against Jessie's chest. He carried her back to the sunlight. Just outside the barn was an area enclosed by a crumbling stone wall, where the grass grew thick and soft. Jessie and Daisy called it the heifer yard. It was their favorite picnic spot. "Would Emmy like some food?" Daisy asked in a soft but eager voice. "Food!" cooed Emmy. "Good," Daisy cooed back. She quickly peeled hard-boiled eggs and set the tiny pieces of shell on the ground. Jessie sat cross-legged and held Emmy on his lap. He reached for a piece of shell and offered it to her. She took it in her claws and sniffed it, then nibbled, sighed, hiccuped, and said, "Good." Jessie fed her a bit of shell one after another, and crunched them up like they were potato chips. When Jessie felt it was safe to do so, he let Emmy down gently next to her eggshell chips and let her help herself. Then he and Daisy tucked into their soggy tuna sandwiches, with one eye on Emmy, and drank the slightly warm lemonade out of the thermos. Jessie checked his wristwatch. It was 3 o'clock in Gold Mine City, 1 o'clock in the morning in Africa. He had been so excited this morning that he had not checked his email. Life had gotten very busy all of a sudden. This afternoon, sun poured down on Jessie's shoulders like melted butter and made him feel drowsy. The cousins stretched out on the warm green grass as Emmy finished off the last of her chips, then curled up between them. In no time, all three were asleep. Jessie woke up and startled and gasped. He had been dreaming that he was watching a great cloud of dust whirling down the old lane that led to the barn. At the center of the dust was the $1 million car. It took him a few good seconds of sitting and blinking at the empty lane to convince himself the dream wasn't real. His skin prickled with relief. Daisy was still asleep, but Emmy was wide awake and standing on Daisy's chest, holding Daisy's gold locket in her forepaws. Emmy began cooing softly. Daisy stirred at the sound, opened her eyes, and smiled sleepily. "I think Emmy likes your locket," said Jessie. "Like locket," said the baby dragon. "Like a lot." Emmy held the locket and chanted, "Locket, locket." "That's my baby locket," Daisy said to Emmy. It was my mother's when she was a little girl. Daisy opened the locket and showed Emmy the tiny photographs inside. Head cocked, Emmy peered at the 2 miniature pictures. See, that is my mom when she was little, with her sheepdog, Fluffy. And this one here is my father holding a rock. My father always loved rocks, even when he was a little boy, Daisy said. Want locket, Emmy said, taking the locket in her shiny green talons. Seems like she really wants it, Daisy. Jessie paused softly. Hey, do you think that's what Professor Anderson meant by hoarding? In his book, I mean? Somewhat nervously, Daisy said, Could I have my locket back, please, Emmy? Emmy pressed it to her mouth, then held it out to Daisy. Locket back, Daisy. Thank you, said Daisy, and snapped the locket shut and tucked it inside her t-shirt. Emmy scrambled off Daisy and lit out across the heifer yard. Yikes, yelled Daisy. Where's she going now? Emmy disappeared into the barn. Jessie bounded to his feet and ran after her. Daisy was fast on his heels. They found Emmy perched on a long wooden shelf, examining things in the Museum of Magic. They had been working on the collection ever since Jessie had arrived around Easter time, and it included anything they felt might have magical powers. Daisy pointed to the framed pressed flowers. Some of them heal you, some of them hurt you. Others make you strong, brave, smart, or calm, she explained to Emmy. That's what it says in my herbal. That's a book Miss Elodie gave me. Garden gnome, said Emmy, nodding quickly. Right. We never eat the flowers, of course, Jessie explained. It's too fun to think about the powers they possess in their petals and stems. Roots, crooned Emmy. Then she moved to the skulls, which were Jessie's domain. We found these in the fields, in the deep woods, he told her. Some of them still had flesh on them and were kind of gross. So I boiled them in a pot in the rock shop. They're pretty clean now. The Native Americans and some African tribes believed that the spirits of dead animals lived on their skulls. We've got a calf, a mouse, a dog, and a wild cat, and something we haven't figured out yet. Emmy moved to what Jessie and Daisy called the magical doorknob, made of bright green crystal. That came from the door to a magical world, Daisy explained. Then there was the magical milking stool, the magical potion bottle, and the magical horseshoe. That stool is for sitting down during interactions, Jessie explained. The blue bottle there held potions, and those horseshoes ward off bad luck and keep you from getting struck by lightning. Then there's that stuff up there, he said, pointing to an old rusty farm tool hanging high on the barn wall. We think that stuff might be magical, but it might just be old. Emmy's attention was drawn to the crusty old metal ball about the size of a peach. She wrapped it in her arms and crooned. That, said Daisy, is a sorcerer's sphere. See, Jessie explained to Emmy, the man who once owned this farm wasn't just a farmer. He was a magical dairyman, a sorcerer. That's the sphere he used to cast his spells. His cows gave magic milk, said Daisy, and when you drank the milk, you had the power to fly and talk to animals, said Jessie. And breathe underwater, Daisy added. Or at least we think. Standing on her hind legs, Emmy rolled the sorcerer's sphere gently back and forth. Her pulse fluttered in her throat. Like, she said. Like, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots. Here we go again, said Daisy. She's definitely hoarding. Maybe not, said Jessie. It's not like it's gold or anything. He stopped. Or is it? Could there be gold beneath the dirt and the rust? We found it in the brook in the pasture, Daisy told Emmy. We figure it belonged to the farmer. Maybe it's a piece from one of the old machines, Jessie said. Emmy shook her head quickly. Not, she said. You mean it didn't come from a machine? This old, Emmy said. This old. It's real old, Jessie said, agreeing. The farmer moved away ages ago, before Jessie and I were even born. Old, Emmy insisted with a rapid shake of her head. From the time before. Jessie shot Daisy a look. Really? Daisy asked. So what is it then? The dragon stood taller, looked around, if searching the barn for the answer. Finally she said, I forget. Eyes whirling. That's a big help, said Daisy. Show Emmy, Emmy urged. Show Emmy. Where? Now. Whoa, said Jessie. Show Emmy where now what? Emmy turned away from the sorcerer's sphere and launched herself off the shelf before either cousin could catch her. She lifted her arms, and the delicate web of skin beneath each arm was enough for her to float to the floor like a miniature hang glider. She scampered out the barn door. Maybe she wants us to show her where we found this sphere, Daisy suggested. When the cousins caught up with the dragon, they led her towards the brook to the spot where the moss grew on the bank, like the tufts of green velvet quilt. It was here, said Daisy, pointing to the deepest part of the brook. At this time of year, the water came up to the cousins' chests. We found it in August, when the water's really low. Jessie knelt down on the soft moss and dipped his hand in the water. He pulled back. The brook, which flowed down from the old mother, was freezing. It couldn't be warm enough to swim in until at least mid-August. Emmy stood on the bright green moss and stared into the brook. After a while, she began to make a humming noise, her throat throbbing. She stopped, teetered. Next thing they knew, Emmy had tumbled into the water, head first with a splash. Yikes, screamed Daisy. I can't see her. Can you? Jessie tried to see beneath the surface, but the reflection of the sun and the water made it was nearly impossible. Daisy was already tearing off her sneakers and socks. She pulled her sweatshirt over her head and tossed it to the bank. Then she waded into the brook, pinching her nose between her fingers, and ducked underwater. Seconds passed, and Jessie waited. What if Daisy and Emmy both drowned, or more likely froze to death? He kicked off his sneakers, peeled off his socks, took a deep breath, and prepared to save them both. Just then Daisy stood up in the middle of the brook, sputtering, coughing. She was holding Emmy high in one hand. Daisy waded toward the bank and thrust Emmy at Jessie. Wrap her in my sweatshirt. I have to get out of this wet stuff, or I'm going to freeze to death. Plan? Daisy didn't wait for an answer. She flapped like a wet seal. She and Jessie kept a set of clothes in the barn in an old wooden chest. Jessie wrapped Emmy up in Daisy's dry sweatshirt. She held her and rubbed her briskly until the shivering eased. Land's sakes, Emmy cried, sounding just like Miss Elodie. What happened, Emmy? Fear for Emmy, she said. Well, I was pretty scared too, Jessie told her. Daisy soon came back in dry clothes, rubbing her hair with a beach towel. What frightened you? She asked Emmy. See things, said Emmy. What things? Asked Daisy, plopping down on the bank. Bad man, said Emmy. What bad man? Said Daisy. There was no bad man down there. All I saw were rocks and moss and you poor thing. See bad man, Emmy said. Bad man, get Emmy. Emmy sad. Help Emmy, Jessie. Daisy. Mama. Jessie held Emmy tighter and stared at Daisy. Daisy shrugged helplessly. Emmy stiffened in his arms. St. George, she cried, then passed out. And that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 is called Lost and Found.